Hey everybody, welcome, and we're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. All right, it is 2:40, so we are going to get started. So hi everyone, and thank you so much for attending our session today, Women with Disabilities, Invisibility within a Sexist and Ableist Society. Before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. Please leave your cameras off and your microphones muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Jody Fiorini. Dr. Fiorini is the department head of the Counseling, Educational Leadership, and Educational and School Psychology Department at Wichita State University. She received her PhD in counselor education and supervision from Syracuse University. Her emphasis as a school and higher education counselor was working with students with physical and learning disabilities. She now works as the department head of the Counseling, Educational Leadership, Educational, and School Psychology Department at Wichita State University. Dr. Fiorini has significant multicultural training, is committed to social justice issues, and teaches courses in disability, race, class, and gender counseling. Dr. Fiorini's areas of specialization include counseling individuals with physical, emotional, and learning disabilities and their family members, counseling individuals through grief and loss, counseling individuals with anxiety and depression, and helping clients cope with the stressful life situations and transitions. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm turning it over to you, Dr. Fiorini. And you are on mute.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending this session. I am very excited to talk about this issue. I've been researching gender issues in disability for a number of years, and it's a little sad to say that not as much has changed over the years as I wish. But let me start out by giving you some background about the research findings to date. So when you investigate gender issues around disability, you find things like that women in general tend to be more accepting and understanding and have more favorable attitudes toward individuals with disabilities, particularly physical, than males do. And then you see a lot more caregivers and support systems that are female for that reason. the disability policy in general. So if you think about how vocational rehab works in the United States, how systems are in place for Social Security and those kinds of things for individuals with disabilities, was created for men who were returning to work from war. So if you think about where this came from, you see that it's very male dominated, and considers occupational things and areas around men with disabilities, around things like vocation, autonomy, and independence, which may or may not be relevant for women. So I always say that, you know, disability is an equal opportunity oppressor. You know, it's, if you are disabled, you are likely to end up in the category of low income because it tends to impact medical bills. It tends to impact your vocation, whether or not you can continue with the work that you were doing before. So individuals with disabilities face the highest rates of poverty, unemployment, and dependency. And there is also limits on where you can live, where you can go based on how accessible the buildings are. How, if you're living in the Northeast like I used to, you know, how much does snow impact where you can go? How diligent are people in raking leaves, or, you know, making their, even if they are accessible, sometimes they are not accessible. But when you start to dive into the research around disability, you tend to very quickly realize that there's a dearth of information about women, and most of it's written by men about women. That is changing, and that's heartening to see, but it still predominates. So I'll give you some statistics that'll give you an idea, set the stage for you. 60% of men with disabilities have paying jobs versus 29% for women. Employers are less likely to hire women with disabilities than men. And that is, so we're going to talk about intersectionality and how important that is. So if you're a woman of color, that's even worse in terms of employability or the amount of pay you make. So all of those disparities that you see in the general population are also applied to individuals with disabilities, and the range is lower. So you have poverty for women with disabilities even lower, and then poverty for women with disabilities of color even lower than that. So those are things to think about when you examine these issues. The leaders of the disability movement tend to be men, and the rehab counselors tend to be men. Not always. It is getting better, but the participation, it seems as though the advocates and parents, for example, are women who get involved and try to advocate for their children. But as far as the leadership of disability movements, they tend to be male. Women with disabilities are trained for less skilled jobs due to gender bias. So the gender bias that exists, for example, I train school counselors, and we try to make a real point of trying to be as aware of gender bias, making sure that your posters have, you know, examples of firefighters who are women, you know, making sure that people are aware of careers, and you're not preventing people from dreaming. I guess that's the way that I think about it. Well, in the rehab establishment, the goal is to get people employed, to close the case. And what I've seen over my career is, for example, in my profession, counseling, there's no undergraduate degree in that. It's a master's degree. Well, if you aspire to be a counselor, very often the rehab counselors will redirect you to a different kind of career that doesn't take a master's, because that's more expensive and it takes longer. So you see women, well, how about being, this? How about being a case manager with a bachelor's level or a associate's degree, and then cutting off funding for other positions. Women receive fewer and less generous benefits because of the income base. So the discrepancy in income that all women experience, your income when you become disabled, just like when you retire, is based on what you made before. So if you make less than men, because for the privilege of being a woman, then when you become disabled, that also is a factor. So you receive less benefits than males. And women are overrepresented in SSI, which is Social Security, because a lot of them are not encouraged to enter the workforce. So they are collecting SSI and feeling unproductive, some women report. They are more likely to be without a spouse than a disabled man, and more likely to be left by a partner when they become disabled. So, for example, if you look at the research literature and people who've been in a traumatic injury from a car accident or something, have a major health impairment, something that leaves them with a disability, a mobility impairment, a stroke, something like that, women will stay with their partner. Men will leave the relationship, which leaves women alone. That's a theme that you will see: invisibility and loneliness. They are more likely to be stigmatized and have poor self-concepts based on our society. If you think about it, is very youth-oriented and athletic-oriented. And so people who can't participate in certain activities are seen as lesser. And that becomes part of the identity issue with individuals with disabilities. I've experienced this firsthand. Individuals with disabilities, women who decide to have children, are condemned and sometimes told by their obstetricians or their physicians that it's selfish for them to even consider having children. Because how could you? You're in a wheelchair. How are you going to take care of that child? Even though there are millions of women across the world who manage to have children and have a disability. But that's a common theme that I have heard with my clients in different geographic locations and across time. And they're more likely to be denied access to education, employment, and financial assistance. For example, there are OVR, Office of Vocational Rehab, has entrepreneurial grants, for example, to start somebody to start their own business. And I've often noticed that the rehab counselors will tell the men about that program and very seldom tell the women, as though women aren't entrepreneurs or don't have that idea of working from home, especially right now with COVID. So they're not even introduced to the possibilities, the services, or the programs that they're entitled to. And they're less likely to receive rehab services, again, because people don't refer them to rehab. It's almost as though, the family will take care of them, or they're going to just be staying at home anyway. There are so many assumptions. The majority of healthcare practitioners are unaware of these issues that I'm explaining to you. And if you ask, when you look at the research, if research asks medical providers who has the tougher time with disability, men or women, they will overwhelmingly say men. And I find that interesting as well. And part of the reason is because the women who state their frustrations, either to their healthcare provider or to the rehab establishment, are actually, they're denigrated for that. They're told to be quiet. And that's another theme that I see in the literature, along with the invisibility, is stay in your lane, just be a quiet, good person with a disability. I get frustrated. So if you see some passion start to come out as I talk about these things, I get very passionate about the women that I have worked with over the years that have experienced this. So if there is an injury that mars aesthetics, for example, something that it has scars or burns, something that limbs are missing, that has an aesthetic issue, that has greater significance for women, because sexuality, we'll see this later, is an area that's impacted for women very much based on appearance. So that's something to keep in mind. Men are more impacted by disabilities that interfere with their capacity to work or make them feel a sense of dependence. And one thing that I do want to say is I don't want to give the impression that men who have disabilities don't experience a great deal. They do. And I don't want to minimize that. I just want to make people aware of issues that women face particularly. Women, not surprisingly, who self-report say that they're really worried more about how the disability is going to impact their personal relationships. What's the relationship with their spouse going to be now? How about my children? Will I be able to engage in friendships? Will I be able to go out? Will I be able to travel and see my family? Where men very often, especially at the initial time of disability, are much more concerned about, am I going to be a productive member of society? How are other men going to look at me as a provider? So the worries and the thoughts tend to be different. And I know that sounds very stereotypical, but ironically, that's still being socialized, and not surprising that those are the results that we see. So interestingly, women report, and if you do research into this and ask people about women and sexuality that have disabilities, people will be like, I don't think they have sex. They're not seen as sexual beings once they have a disability. So things around body image, dependence, vulnerability. So ironically, although they're seen as asexual, they are also seen as potential victims for sexual assault because they're seen as passive or targets. No one talks to, I'm talking medical providers, others, about things like intimacy and sexuality or family planning. How do you manage menstruation? What does that look like when you are experiencing this disability? How does menopause impact women with disabilities? It's the insensitivity that I hear in the stories from the women that I work with is just kind of appalling. Like the assumption is, well, you don't need family planning. It's not like you're having sex. It's like, oh, you just become an asexual being because you have a disability. And then, so there are themes. I have done some qualitative and quantitative research around this topic. And I've asked individuals what the themes that they experience as a woman with a disability. And one of the things that comes up is the sense of role-lessness. Like I no longer fit in the places that I used to, as an independent worker. I'm now not seen as the nurturer, but needing nurturing. I need people to wait on me or pay attention to me. And even if that's not the case, even if that person is perfectly capable of being independent and being nurturing, the themes of how people view them has changed their role. And the biggest thing I see is this sense of invisibility, that even if I'm somewhere, I'm walking down the street, well, some people can't even walk down the street, but However, is people don't make eye contact with me. People pretend that I am not there. And when I talk to my students about this, my counseling students, there is a normal response that people have, a Gestalt response, if any of you are familiar with that, is we look for whole, body whole, and normal, our brains. And so if you see somebody with a limb missing, if you see somebody whose aesthetic is different, you have an automatic response like to that, like there's something different here. And that's normal. And I tell my students, that's a normal response that your brain does. Oh, something is different here than what I'm used to. The problem is that causes the vast majority of people then to avoid that person because they're either ashamed for having had that feeling, or they're not sure how to interact with that person. So that leads them to just not interact. And that leaves the clients feeling invisible, lonely, people not making eye contact, just ignoring them. And I always talk about how we socialize children around this issue. So, if you've got a friend who, you're taking your kid to the grocery store and they see somebody who's in a wheelchair, kids are very honest and forthright, and they're going to say, hey, what happened to your legs? How come you can't walk? And what's the first thing that a parent does with that? Shh, don't ask that. That's rude. So we train our children to think that it's secretive, that it's rude, that we don't talk about disability, and we certainly don't talk to people with disabilities. And that has long-term implications as well. And so if a woman is fighting against this dependent role and saying, hey, I want access to this, I want a job, I want a master's degree, I want a PhD, I want to do this, they're often told by practitioners and even counselors, well, you're just in denial, that you just have to face the fact that you're just not the person you were once, and that's not a realistic goal. So makes me mad. Another theme that women with disabilities experience is this expectation of cheerfulness, that you're expected to be just optimistic and conceal any feelings of frustration, anger, and to make the situation better for other people. So you're often kind of ignoring your own pain and anger in order to not rock the boat and to make other people feel more comfortable. And that leads to, pent up emotions, feeling unheard, feeling that your voices have been excluded. And what you find is the places that they need the most support from, so church, school, their cultural community, the LGBTQ community, their neighbors, are the very ones that are excluding them from activities. I remember when I visited a school, I was doing a site visit, and this is my area of interest. So I just asked the school, I saw there was a poster for a career fair. And I said to the school counselor, I'm like, oh, so, who does the counseling for the career counseling for the students with disabilities, and are they excited about this career fair? And I found out that the school counselor said, oh, we don't do that. The special ed department does that, which then led me to go down the hall to the special ed department and ask the same question. So who works with the students with disabilities around career issues? And they said, oh, counseling office does that. So basically nobody was doing that. And I've also noticed that transition planning is pretty non-existent in schools, and particularly for the girls. But what I found out was the students with disabilities weren't invited to the career and college fair. They weren't even invited. So needless to say, I had a little in service with the folks at that school district. So when we talk about intersectionality, if you are a woman of color with a disability, and 2/3 of African Americans with disabilities are women. So if you are in this category, you're going to be more likely a female than a male. It's more than just being a female with a disability or just being a person of color with a disability. It's multiple identities here that all contribute. So I once had a client, and this won't mean anything to you, but think of, I don't know if there are kind of redneck areas, and I assume there are where you live, but she lived in that town near the campus where people are not very accepting of others. And it's very small, so there really weren't, she was lonely. She came to counseling because she wanted to find a partner. Well, she was an African-American lesbian woman in a wheelchair in this really rural town. And all I could think of is how many strikes against you can you have in terms of being able to find a partner? And so we worked on that, and eventually she did find someone fantastic through online dating. That was a whole different experience that I could do a whole presentation on, online dating for women with disabilities. But my point is, I can't look at this woman as just a woman with a disability or just a person of color. I have to look at all of the identities when I work with her, because they all matter and they all work together. So there's four stigmatizing statuses that were interactive. And she felt devalued in all of those areas. She didn't really feel a part of her cultural community. She didn't feel a part of her church. She didn't feel a part of the LGBTQ community. And she didn't fit with cultural expectations because she had a disability. And then sexlessness, not being able to access romantic partners or sexual partners because of expectations of body beautiful and athleticism and all of the things that if you do an online profile, people make up, to be honest with you. It might diminish the ability of the person to actually find a partner. One of the other issues that comes up with these individuals is that if they've held this superwoman role that is still expected in African-American culture of women to be, head of household, of making a lot of the financial decisions and having a powerful role, sometimes when the disability comes, that ability to contribute financially or be this superwoman that can do it all is taken away. And that leads to an identity crisis in a lot of the individuals with disabilities who are women of color that I've worked with. And just as so basically any of the stereotypes and the difficulties that women of color experience in general population are just exacerbated by having a disability. So skin color issues, darker skinned individuals get less care, less opportunities than lighter skinned women. And that still exists within the disability community. And it's not that churches don't provide support, it's that there's this kind of a let me take care of you support, a fostering of dependency support, as opposed to a let me help you get a job and let me, be your friend and let's go, do something fun. So it's a different kind of support than what they're looking for. And all of the theories within rehab counseling, within the rehab establishment, are built off of Western male Eurocentric theories. And that definitely has an impact on how, even if women of color who have disabilities come to counseling, so if the counselor or the person who is working with them or the healthcare provider holds these stereotypes, that's going to impact that woman, because that's the way we teach, unfortunately. So lesbian women with disabilities, again, have an added dilemma, another intersectionality that makes their life interesting. So they might face discrimination from heterosexist society and able-bodied gay community. So if you do investigate the research literature around the gay community, very often the activities that are engaged in are around body. And I would say in this case, I also see a lot of men who struggle to be a part of the gay community because they're excluded from activities. But that is also the case with women. That assumed asexuality pervades, that not seen as partners because we see people with disabilities as asexual. There's been research that shows that disability is seen as weakness within the lesbian community. And because these notions that the person who uses a wheelchair is somehow lesser or less capable, and that's called the spread effect, and I could talk about that forever too, but anyway, to put these things on to people with disabilities as though they're lesser, as people will shout at them thinking they have hearing problems, that sort of thing. That if in a community that values strength, they feel that more acutely, that they're seen as weak or lesser because of being disabled. Yes, and if they're dependent on transportation issues, they're not even able sometimes to attend events, get to places, or they're dependent on family or other people to get them rides, or they're at the mercy of the bus schedule that has the lift. There's, just a lot of things that make it difficult. I don't want to leave men out because they also have issues around intimacy and sexuality, loneliness, isolation, invisibility again. And the biggest theme that I see with men is this loss of productiveness. I had one client, for example, say, the first thing that men ask each other is, what do you do? And if you don't, I apologize for my dog. If you don't have a vocation, that makes it very difficult for that individual to interact. There's also a sense of emasculation for men. For the very first time, they experience this powerlessness, this invisibility, patronizing and marginalizing that women have been used to experiencing. This may be the first time for them, so it's a real slap in the face for an individual who is used to being in charge. So in my own research, I'm looking at things like, where do these things come from? So I'm interviewing a lot of people and saying, how did you learn about disability? What comes to mind when you think of disability? And, the themes that I hear from individuals is, I never knew or saw anybody with a disability when I was a kid. The special ed kids were over in that room, or they were downstairs in the church because we didn't have an elevator. So people are exploring things and saying, I didn't really know anything. So anything I've gotten has been from media. Others talked about this experience of feeling sorry for people with disabilities, that they were taught that, oh, that poor person with the wheelchair, that's just terrible. And so that's continued as they became adults. Some of them talked about, I used to pick on the kids with disabilities. I used to taunt them because they were different and they were easy targets. And that was cool to do. And some of the individuals have residual guilt from having participated in that bullying behavior, and as a result, avoid people with disability in adulthood. Some people talked about, seeing people with disabilities as overcomers, as heroes, that spread affect in the other way, as opposed to just folks that are like you. And a lot of them, they would always say, well, they're just like us, except, and then there would be except they don't engage in sex, or they don't do this, or they don't do that. So it was almost always pejorative, the opinions. I'm having trouble finding my next slide. So my implications to you is we can't do anything about this until this becomes a topic of discussion that's out there regularly. When Joanne Rusnak asked me if I would present, she specifically said, we need some stuff around disability issues. Would you present? And I'm like, absolutely. And can I talk about gender? And she's like, absolutely. So we need more advocacy efforts. And it all comes from awareness. Like, if people know that this is an issue, then we can start working on it and helping women with disabilities to participate and become leaders in their field and to get paid for it. And that you have to start looking at this intersectional, these multiple identities that individuals with disabilities have, and how that contributes and what their roles are. What is it like to be mother, sister, daughter, friend, lover, when you have these multiple intersections of identity? So that's kind of what I wanted to share. I think, yeah, this is a different thing. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Let me stop my share. What's everybody thinking? Chat.
Okay, Jody, we do have one question posted, and one of our participants asked, and I can relate to this as well, what do you do when your child asks somebody what happened to your leg? Do you stand back and just wait for it, or do you ask the person if they're comfortable with the question?
No, usually the person with the disability is used to it, first of all. But I will say it depends on where they are in their own identity development. So for those of you who are knowledgeable about racial identity development models, there is one for disability that looks very similar. So if you have somebody who's in that first stages, the conformity stages, they are not going to want to be picked out about their disability. But if they're in a different stage, they will. So I just say that's natural. The person with the disability will let the child know if it's okay. And usually what they will say is, well, I had an accident and now my legs don't work, So I think that's a better experience to just, normalize that. And if the person says, I don't want to talk about that, that's something that you can have a conversation with your child about later. Does that answer that question?
I think it does.
I say go for it. The invisibility gotta go.
And Angela B asked, can you go back to the emasculation slide? She missed that and would like to see it again if possible.
Oh, sure. Let me find it.
And if anyone else has questions, please post that in the chat.
Let me find it. Okay, so one of the biggest topics that come up when you work with men with disabilities, or when you do the research around this, is that men feel that their role as men, as defined by the gender stereotypes and the socialization that happens in society, is taken away. So now I'm not seen as productive. I'm patronized, I'm devalued, I'm marginalized, I don't count. My voice is no longer heard. And the the big shocker is that it's the first time they've experienced it. So I'm not sure who was asking the question, but feel free to ask me more if you have questions around that. This is a population I really enjoy working with, men with disabilities, to kind of look at all of these stereotypes that we have been fed, and how do you fit in now? Where can you find your role?
I don't see another question regarding that, but I do have another question, and it is, do you see that women as caretakers of those who are disabled struggle in similar ways to women who are disabled?
You bet. Great point. So one of the unusual things about the ADA, so the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, is that there is a protection for caregivers. And not a lot of people realize that. So, for example, if you're employed and your employer, I'm going to kill my dog. Anyway, so if you're employed and your employer discriminates against you because you are taking too much time to care for a child with a disability, or you're taking too much time to care for an elderly person in your family, you can sue on the basis of ADA for discrimination. But yes, so you lose friends, for example, they don't, it's too much trouble to ask, and they figure you're busy, and you kind of experience the same stigma as the individual with disability. And I see that commonly. And it tends to be the woman that's experiencing that. I assume the person that asked that question probably has experienced that firsthand.
Okay, and next question is, would love to know if there are studies about women with invisible disabilities versus those with visible disabilities.
Yeah, and there are. I could do a whole, I apologize because my thing was really built around visible disabilities, but invisible disabilities are even more difficult in a lot of ways, because people, they don't believe the person, so if somebody has fibromyalgia or lupus or one of the autoimmune, and they have difficulty walking, but they're able-bodied and don't use a wheelchair, they get dirty looks when they use the handicap parking. There's a whole other ballgame to invisible disabilities, and talking about invisibility. And I could talk about that forever too. But yeah, that's a really, really big issue.
Okay, and another participant has asked if your research includes less visible disabilities like learning challenges, and are there differences?
Yep. So my dissertation was on social emotional aspects of learning disabilities, and so my profession, counseling profession, doesn't even have any CACREP guidelines, accreditation guidelines that have us teach counselors, mental health or school counselors, to have any understanding of disability issues. And what I investigated was how many on your caseload, what's the time analysis, how many students with learning disabilities are you working with? And the caseload was about 50%. 50% of the students that school counselors were seeing in New York State at the time had learning disabilities. And how much training have you had? 0. So the individuals with learning disabilities they're more at risk for things like suicide, drinking and drugs, or loneliness. Hey, I'm so sorry. So they're in this category that's in that invisible category. And if they also have social skills deficits, then that's also something that we need to be helping with to help them understand social cues, for example. Maybe they turn off potential partners because of not reading social cues from people. But yeah, that's an area that's a real passion for me. Let's see, I'm reading your chat. Major depression. If you look at the research, interestingly, I've done research where I've asked people, hundreds of people, to rank which disabilities would be best to have and which would be worst to have. And always at the very bottom are schizophrenia and dementia. So anything that kind of takes away your ability to connect with reality or connect with people. So, and the mental illness is actually at the bottom. I would rather lose my limbs than have a major depressive disorder. And that was really eye-opening for me, because that wasn't the results I was expecting.
Did you address the question already about being excluded from social groups? Did you see that? Okay, so do your studies indicate why or what prompts women with disabilities to become excluded from their social groups?
Oh, yeah. So it's, how do I want to put this? It's similar to when social groups have any change in them. So if your best friend group has a baby, that person maybe start to be excluded from things. If you have a group that has, they're all single people and then somebody gets married, they start to be excluded from things because they're not single anymore. It's kind of just you're different now. Or the person themselves can't cope with the change in their friend. So they start to exclude them without even meaning to. It's too difficult for me to cope with the fact that you have a disability, or I put all this stuff on you that it must be terrible. It must be terrible to have a disability. And so therefore I'm not going to be around you, which is the time that they need them the most. Did I answer that question?
I believe so. To tag onto that question, another member says, or soul-crushing major depression that is medically managed but still rears its ugly head.
Yep. Bipolar disorder is another one. You know, it's one of the hardest ones to manage. And students, those of you who work on college campuses, it's hard to hold it together for 16 weeks if you have bipolar disorder. That's a long time. So chances are that person's going to spike one way or the other during a semester. And faculty, their loved ones, a lot of people just don't get it. They get tired of it and they don't get the support that they need.
Getting back to the caretaker question, would caretakers find it beneficial to seek any kind of accommodations, or is there a different way for them to seek support?
Yeah, they would do it the same way. So if it's your employer, you would go to HR and, you know, state, this is, you know, my experience. I am a caretaker of somebody with a disability that's covered under ADA. And if this behavior, this discrimination doesn't stop, I'm going to sue. I mean, it's the same way you would if you were an employed person with a disability. But I want people to know this is a caveat of the law, because it's people feel helpless that are in that position, but that's there to support you. The other part of ADA that people don't realize is that you are covered whether if you have a disability or you're perceived to have a disability. So for example, somebody who's had burns or has like a port wine birthmark or something like that, where their aesthetic is marred, doesn't have any physical disabilities, but they're perceived as having them. So they're covered under ADA as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, and then another question also related to that is, what can you share about an older woman about aging disabilities in the workforce?
Yeah, you want to talk about multiple identities. So any of the issues that aging women in the workforce are looking to get into the workforce is exacerbated by the disability. So that's a whole other caveat that we could get into. Just, and I don't want to sound depressing. I know this is depressing to hear about, but the reason that I want to bring this all to the fore is so that we can talk about it and we can advocate and help support our individuals with disabilities, women. And, you know, so if you have students in college who are, you know, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s, going back for a second career, who have disabilities, don't poo-poo that or think that there's something wrong with that. It's awesome. That's something to be celebrated and supported. We see it a lot in our field. We see a lot of career changers go into counseling. They've done their career in money making, whatever. They're feeling unfulfilled and they want to do something different. And so we get, I have a lot of retirees, some with and without disabilities, that enter our field.
Okay. And does the research document similarities or differences in the experiences of women with disabilities based on whether they are born with a disability versus if they become disabled later?
Yes. So the research shows that individuals who were born with their disability rather than acquire it have a little better time because their identity has always been around having that disability, and they've learned from the get-go how to deal with it, you know, and how to respond to things. If you acquire a disability, that's when you have the issues around marriage, partners leaving, job, that sort of thing. So in some ways, it's better, it's easier to adjust to disability that's born than it is acquired.
Okay, that is all of the questions I see, and we are right at 3:30.
Okay, you guys are awesome.
Thank you so much, Jody.
Okay, thank you.
I believe
you,
Misty.
Yes.
Misty, it's
Thank you,
yours.
Dr. Fiorini. Thanks everyone for attending the Women with Disabilities and Visibility Within a Sexist and Ableist Society session. The closing session will begin at 3:40. You can check the chat room for the link to the closing session. And thank you again so much, Dr. Fiorini.
And sorry about my dogs.
It's the world we live in now.